Hello and welcome to this recording then of the poem Ozymandias by Percy Shelley. As normal, we're going to be looking at Assessment Focus 1, the understanding of what the poem is about, Assessment Focus 2, its language, form and structure and the effects that are created for the audience or the reader, and AO3 or Assessment Focus 3, the context, that is understanding of the poem and the time it was written and why we engage with it in perhaps the way that we do. First then, a little bit about Percy himself. He was inspired to write the poem by the recent acquisition of the fragment of the statue Ramesses II by the British Museum in 1817. He'd always liked the idea of looking at rulers in history and perhaps is looking at the poem, also looking at this statue and wanting to write about this once great ruler. The French Emperor Napoleon had also wanted this statue for himself, but this once great leader was in prison at the time and so was unable to claim it, hence it went to the British Museum. Percy Shelley himself was married to the much better known Mary Shelley, who was becoming more and more famous for writing the famous book Frankenstein. Percy, being a man, was not used to being overshadowed by his wife, and so might have struggled as her fame grew and grew. Shelley was known to be a bit of a troublemaker at school and beyond. He lived in the years after the French Revolution and had a reputation of fighting against authority. Let's listen now to a clip then about Percy and his contemporaries.
On the early 1820s, we can identify the end of the great age of English Romantic poetry. Wordsworth and Coleridge were already past their peak. Keats died in 1821. Byron's death came 3 years later, and in the intervening time, the career of the final great English poet of his age was tragically cut short. His name was Percy Shelley. Born in 1792, Shelley was perhaps the most radical thinker of all the Romantic poets. As a student at Oxford University, he was expelled for publishing a pamphlet on atheism. He became a friend of the philosopher William Godwin, an early socialist with a profound dislike for any form of authority. The influence of Godwin permeated his first important work, Queen Mab, a poem completed in the Lake District that had so inspired Wordsworth and Coleridge. It is a long, philosophical poem, a radical work that also revealed the young Shelley's respect for the ancient world. In it, he laments the passing of the classical age.
Where Athens, Rome and Sparta stood, there is a moral desert now. Where Cicero and Antoninus lived, a cowed and hypocritical monk prays, curses and deceives.
Queen Mab is really a kind of pamphlet poem. It's not Shelley at his great imaginative, which really isn't until 2 or 3 years later, say 1816. What makes him such a revolutionary character is that he thinks that everything should be knocked down and start again. He loved the idea of change, even the violence of change, but for perfectibility's sake. And it was a kind of anarchy, really. Reason should govern all human affairs. You didn't need any government because you just had to be reasonable with each other. You could see that my need was greater than yours, so you give me everything you had. This kind of reasonableness.
As you heard then, Shelley loved the idea of the ancient world and all the rulers that lived in it, but wasn't so keen on current governments. He felt that if someone needed something, you simply asked and you got given it. You can imagine then his dislike when people potentially tried to give him orders and told him what to do. It's hard to really understand the poem Ozymandias without knowing a little bit about Ramesses II, the ruler on which the poem is based. The video at the top right, currently playing at the moment, is a video taken from Egypt with a statue of Ramesses is being uncovered. Ramesses himself lived between 1290 to 1224 BC. His name was corrupted by the Greeks who called him as Ozymandias. Thereby then the poem never mentions the actual ruler's name. It's like the real name has already been forgotten and replaced by the Greek version. He was one of the greatest pharaohs in Egypt and is seen to be the most powerful ruler who ever lived. He was not known to be any more cruel than any of the other pharaohs around at the time, so the thought is that Shelley exaggerates the cruel nature for poetic effect in the poem. Ramesses is known to have over 200 wives and over 156 children. That is a man dedicated then to expanding his legacy and making sure his genes will live forever. Current rulers feel the same way. I'm now playing a video at the bottom of the screen where you can see the statue of Saddam Hussein being pulled down in Baghdad in Iraq. This is round about 2001. The statue for Saddam Hussein also represented his power. He put statues all round the city to show he had his eyes on everybody and was trying to control everybody. Now, when the UK and the US invaded Iraq around about 2001-2002 in the Second Gulf War, we immediately then set about pulling down the signals or signifiers of Saddam's authority. You can see the people at the time disrespecting the statue. They're showing relief at the fact this man is gone and taking it out on the statue itself. You can see it's been pulled down by a crane and the crowds are gathered round it as it falls. As it falls to the ground, we can see the crowd reacting. They charged it, they pounce on it. This man's power has now been defeated, and they're now defiant of any symbol of that power. The poem itself then, Ozymandias, by Percy Shelley.
I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless lakes of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions red which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them and the heart that fed, and on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.
Now then, let's go through the poem and look at some key quotes from it. The beginning of the poem then starts off with this strange title, Ozymandias, the Greek name for Ramesses II. This links to the fact that the audience don't even find out the powerful ruler's name as if he's already been forgotten. The poem itself is a retelling of a story that Shelley himself heard. I met a traveller from an antique land who said. This is not Shelley speaking. It is a person he met, a traveller in this antique land, presumably Egypt, telling him about this statue that he saw. We have verbs being used here to suggest how badly the statue has been destroyed by time. We've got sunk, shattered being used there to emphasise how this statue is slowly disappearing or slowly falling apart. The oxymoron, shattered visage, uses a high art word for face, visage, and juxtaposes that with the idea of it being worthless, shattered. This is if the memory of this great ruler is corrupted and worthless. It is no longer this beautiful piece of art it once was. The alliteration, cold command, suggests that the language of a tyrant, a man who doesn't care or listen to his people. He just gives orders from his throne and expects those to be followed. We then have a reference to a sculptor. This idea of the man who actually created the statue. We can see the statue is still a very beautiful object, and you can still appreciate the artistry of the person who made it. It's as if the sculptor, presumably then a slave of Ramesses II, his work has actually lasted longer than the ruler himself. So perhaps some irony there. This slave has become more powerful than the man he is sculpting. The middle of the poem then famously has the quote from the statue itself. The placing of the quote from the statue is near the foot of the poem, or the bottom of the poem, implying the terrifying words of this ruler are now insignificant and of fairly low value. The poem tells us how two-faced this ruler was. We have a ruler who mocks or laughs at his people, but then pretends to care by feeding them the heart that fed. This perhaps then is his way of keeping them under control. If your people are starving, they can't rebel against you. We then have this imperative, this order or command written on the statue itself. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Who's he asking to look at the works? Is that the people of Egypt? Is that indeed God himself? Should be marvelling at the wonders of Ozymandias. Or is it us as readers today? The harsh imperative orders on the lifeless statue are empty, as the voice that said them is now shattered, as we know from the lines above. This makes the poem almost mock the silly words of the statue. The fact that this is shouted emphasise this. We also have this word appear featured here, which suggests that these words magically appear on the bottom of the statue. This might link to God or spirituality, as if these lifeless or meaningless orders are coming from God. The same could be said with the Jesus reference, King of Kings. King of Kings, of course, using capital letters. More on that in a minute. The ending of the poem then tells us that despite these harsh orders, nothing is left of the statue itself. The poem is written as a sonnet, yet here explores self-love rather than romantic love. Ozymandias clearly loves himself rather than his people or anybody else. The enjambment after the word decay suggests that the poem wants us to contemplate that the ruin of this statue hasn't ended. It's still falling apart. The statue itself can still be made out, but at some point in the future it will simply turn to sand. Colossal wreck is yet another oxymoron in the poem. Colossal, something grand, a bit of a spectacle, something that's marvel to look at, and it should be quite impressive. Yet a wreck is something that's damaged and useless. The sands, mentioned at the end of the poem, are symbolic of time, the sands of time. Time goes on forever and is unchanged by the petty powers of man. The sands will always be there, however many cities might be built and then fall apart again. Perhaps Shelley is also wondering what will happen to his poetry when he's gone. Is he seeing this poem as something that's simply in the present, but no one will remember in the future? Perhaps that's what he's worrying about. Ozymandias then, to sum up. Who's it about? It is about a person, possibly Shelley himself, who meets a traveller who tells him a story. What is it about? Well, this traveller tells the poet about the ruins of a once great ruler he saw out in the desert, seemingly in the middle of nowhere. Why was it written? Shelley contemplates the passage of time and its effect on power, or perhaps reputation, perhaps even poetry itself. As normal then, 3 key quotes for you to revise ready for the exam. Around the outside of these, you'll see 2 boxes in orange. These are the structure notes. And indeed, all the boxes are about structure or the language. Pause the screen then to make a note of these yourself before I go on to quote number 2. And then quote number 3. Okay, as normal, we're going to look at different the way you might write this in the exam then, and think about how it might be structured on the page. It will be following the 9-part structure, numbered 1 to 9 on your screen there, with the key parts listed in red. Before you write your steps 1 to 9 though, you would start with a very short introduction, maybe 3 to 4 lines at most, just giving an overview of what the poem is about. Then you would follow the 9 steps, once for the beginning, then again for the middle of the poem, and finally for the poem's conclusion. This would then give you 4 paragraphs in total, although when you put all these 9 steps together, they're likely to be quite long paragraphs. On the screen now then, you can see 2 possible introductions. The one on the left is a grade 6, and the one on the right is around about a grade 8. Immediately you'll notice one is slightly longer than the other, but other than that they're about the same. Let's read through the example on the left first. Ozymandias explores time as we are presented with a corroded statue that's been weathered to nothing by the sands of time. However, Shelley challenges us, the reader, to accept our own lives are transient. When we die, time will take our memories and accomplishments away. This candidate then tells us simply the theme of the poem, time, and how that's shown in the poem itself. It is an overview then of the whole poem in around about 2 sentences. I mentioned the name of the poet, and you can see I've referenced the reader with we and us. On the right-hand side, this is a slightly better answer as it offers 2 different meanings. Simplistically, Ozymandias explores time as we are presented with a corroded statue that's been weathered to nothing by the sands of time. As we study the poem further, we see Shelley challenges us to accept how our own lives are transient. When we die, time will take our memories and accomplishments away. On the face of it, very, very similar. But what the second candidate, the grade 8 candidate, is suggesting is that there are 2 different meanings. One's quite simple. Everyone in the exam hall will probably write that it's about a corroded statue, but then offers a clearly deeper understanding of the poem. As we study the poem further, suggests that this candidate is trying to go a bit further than just a basic response. Once again then, the top is your grade 6 and the bottom is round about the grade 8. I've colour-coded each of the following paragraphs in a certain way. You can see that the quotes or evidence is in red, and you can see links to the reader are in green. Technical language is in blue, light blue, and any use of context is in purple. You'll notice in the grade 8 example at the bottom that there are a lot more quotes being used. There's a lot more evidence to justify what's being said. You've got a list of quotes here, as well as the main quote, which is the same for both, and then analysis at the bottom. The analysis actually goes into a fair bit of detail. If you compare the analysis for the top example here with the one down here, you'll notice this one only uses about a sentence. This one tries to explain it in at least 2 sentences. So it's a lot more developed in its ideas. There is a lot more technical language being used correctly here, and it's of a slightly higher level. This candidate even looks at the punctuation being used and why that might be important. The apostrophe in this case in shattered suggests even the word is being broken apart. Both candidates look at tone of voice here and here, saying what tone the poem will be read in, what kind of tone is being used as we listen to the poem, either in our heads or indeed read out loud. Both candidates mention Shelley or the writer and frequently mention the reader. One is just a bit longer and a bit more developed than the other. This would be paragraph 2. Paragraph 3 would continue in the same vein. It's a bit shorter because there's quite a harsh time limit on how long you've got to write. You've got the grade 6 one at the top and the grade 8 one at the bottom. You'll notice for the second time that the grade 8 candidate is using a lot more context. Remember, context or knowledge of the poem has to be there, and the more often you use it, the better off you're likely to be. It should be linked to the evidence though. It's a bad idea to use the links to context just shoved at the end of a paragraph. Try and incorporate them into the ideas, link them to the quotes. You've got tone of voice being used yet again, and once more the grade 8 example uses a fair number of quotes, but no different perhaps than the grade 6. Perhaps the most telling example is in the last line. The heart that fed is almost vampiric, as if the king fed on the people. An image that prompts relief in the reader as the tyrant is now dead, nothing is left but sand. If we look at the grade 6 example, it's a bit more simplistic. The heart that fed suggests the king fed on the people. The idea of it being vampiric, as if the king is feeding off the people continually to make new life, and indeed live forever, is a bit more sophisticated in the grade 8 example. And lastly then, the last paragraph, looking at the conclusion of the poem, or the ending of the poem, we've got the grade 6 at the top and 8 at the bottom. And once more you can see slightly more technical language in the grade 8 example. We've got the same quotes being used in both, but you can see one's a bit more developed. The ideas have been explained perhaps in slightly better detail or slightly more sophisticated detail. This would give you then your 4 paragraphs for this poem to grade 6 and then grade 8 standard.